Picture this. A man screaming as molten silver pours into his mouth and floods his lungs, until the only sound left is the hiss of boiling flesh. It sounds like a scene from a horror film. But this was no fiction. It was the real punishment ordered by one of Persia's most powerful kings. And here's the question nobody ever asks. Why would Shapur II, a king born with a crown, resort to such savage justice? And was it justice or pure tyranny? And what secret was the man hiding? This is the story of a ruler born with a crown on his head. A king who waged wars against Rome, broke empires, and ruled longer than any monarch in Persian history. But behind the marble throne and jeweled robes was a ruler who believed one terrifying truth. A king's wealth should never be rivaled, not even by the man who counts his coins. By the end of this video, you'll know why Shapur II drowned his own treasurer in molten silver, and why it wasn't just cruelty, but a message to an entire empire. Stick around, because what happened inside the blazing furnaces of Persia will make you question how safe anyone truly is when standing too close to absolute power. Shapur II's story began before he even drew his first breath. In the year 309 CE, King Hormizd II lay dead, and Persia stood on the edge of chaos. The nobles gathered under torchlight, terrified of civil war. And in a move that stunned the entire court, they placed the royal crown on the queen's pregnant belly. The unborn child would be king of Persia, a ceremony performed before a stunned court. Imagine that. A fetus declared king of Persia. When Shapur finally took his first breath, he was already ruler of the mighty Sasanian Empire. And from the day he could walk, he was raised to believe he was chosen by the gods. But the empire he inherited was bleeding. Enemies prowled at every border. And inside the palace, greed was growing like a cancer. In Shapur's youth, Persia was surrounded by threats. To the west, Rome, a bitter rival that had tried for centuries to crush the Persian kings and steal their lands. To the east, Arab tribes raiding Persian caravans, looting towns, and seizing precious trade routes. But perhaps the greatest threat of all was inside Shapur's own palace. Could the king's own treasurer be the reason he poured molten silver into a man's throat? And if so, why? Because while the boy king learned to ride, hunt, and wage war, the Persian nobility grew fat on corruption. Taxes disappeared into private pockets. Silver vanished from royal treasuries. And the one man who touched every coin in the empire was the royal treasurer. The treasurer's name has been lost to history, a shadowy figure whose power rivaled even the king's. By the way, did you know that treasurers in medieval Europe could be executed by having molten lead poured into their ears? History didn't mess around with accountants. He controlled the empire's entire wealth. Silver from conquered lands, taxes squeezed from merchants, and hush money paid by Rome itself. With a single signature, he could unleash an army or crush an entire province into dust. And as Shapur grew into adulthood, he began to suspect the truth. My own treasurer is richer than the throne. But Shapur wasn't just any king. He was the man who would become known as Shapur the Great. And he would tolerate no rivals. As a young man, Shapur II rode at the head of his armies. Crimson banners whipped in the desert wind. Roman fortresses toppled under flaming catapults. Cities like Nisibis fell, their gates splintered, and Roman prisoners marched east in chains. Even Constantine the Great, the emperor who built Constantinople, feared this fierce Persian king. Shapur's soldiers carried banners depicting the sun and moon symbols of divine authority. And in every Persian city, artisans carved his likeness in stone, a tall, fierce figure with a flowing beard, a high, crenellated crown glittering with jewels, eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. But while Shapur was forging an empire, his treasurer was forging something else, entirely a private kingdom built on stolen silver. And soon, one secret ledger would spark the most gruesome execution Persia had ever seen. Because the moment Shapur discovered how much silver was missing from his vaults, the treasurer's fate was sealed. One morning, Shapur ordered a full audit of the royal treasury. Scrolls were unfurled. Chests were weighed. Ledgers were compared against actual silver. And what they found made Shapur's blood run cold. Tons of silver missing. Secret vaults hidden behind palace walls. Bags of coins hoarded in private homes. The treasurer had been skimming off royal wealth for years, quietly building his own empire inside the king's empire. When Shapur summoned the treasurer to court, witnesses said his voice was as cold as steel. A man who steals from the throne, steals from the gods. But the treasurer wasn't ready to die. Some say he offered Shapur half his hidden fortune, bags of silver, jewels, even Roman tribute, in exchange for his life. "My lord," he whispered, "what is silver to a king like you? A small debt, easily forgiven." He should never have said those words. Because Shapur decided there was only one punishment fitting a man whose greed overflowed every vault. Molten silver. And if you think this punishment was cruel, wait until you hear about the Mongol general who boiled his rival alive in oil, or the emperor who forced nobles to drink molten gold. But first we need to see how Shapur turned silver into a weapon of royal wrath. The royal court was packed. Nobles in silk robes lined the marble hall. Servants stood frozen, afraid to breathe too loudly. One court scribe later wrote, "The king's eyes glowed like coals, and when the treasurer screamed, grown men wept and turned away." At the centre of it all stood Shapur II. Tall, regal, the great crest of his crown catching the torchlight. His eyes were like shards of black glass. Beside him, the treasurer knelt in chains. Silver glinted on his fingers and around his neck. Even as a prisoner, he seemed wrapped in wealth. Shapur's voice echoed through the chamber. "Silver was your god. Now let it become your grave." A hush swept the hall. No one dared look the king in the eye, because everyone understood what was coming next. But one question still hung in the torchlit hall. Why molten silver? Why not the sword or exile? What message did Shapur want burned into Persia's memory? In the bowels of Shapur's palace, massive furnaces roared day and night. These were the same furnaces used to melt silver for royal coinage, the legendary drachms that carried Shapur's profile. Blacksmiths toiled amid blazing heat, hammering molten metal into shimmering ingots. That morning, Shapur ordered the fires stoked higher than ever. Silver was brought in by the sackful, poured into great crucibles. Sparks flew like a storm of stars. The liquid metal churned and bubbled, bright as lightning. But the king wasn't content with execution alone. He wanted to make the treasurer a lesson burned into the memory of every noble in Persia. Shapur summoned the entire court to witness the punishment. Noblemen and soldiers crowded the palace courtyard. The sun blazed overhead, but no one dared complain. Guards dragged the treasurer forward, shackles rattling against stone. Despite his fate, the man held his chin high. His lips curled into a sneer, as if daring the king to follow through. Perhaps he thought Shapur would waver. He didn't know Shapur II. Standing over his condemned treasurer, Shapur spoke so all could hear. "You thought silver would protect you. You thought your fortune made you my equal. But there is only one sun in the sky, and only one king in Persia. He raised his arm. The executioners moved forward. Two massive guards pinned the treasurer against a bronze basin. Blacksmiths approached with long iron ladles, dipping them into the crucibles where molten silver glowed like the heart of a star. Steam hissed like serpents. Drops of molten silver spattered on stone with sharp cracks, sending up tiny sparks. The treasurer writhed, eyes rolling. His screams echoed off the marble walls. Time seemed to slow as Shapur raised a hand. Let silver fill the man who tried to fill his own vaults. And then the first ladle of molten silver began to pour. The molten metal cascaded over the treasurer's head, splashing onto his chest. He screamed a sound so sharp and inhuman that even seasoned soldiers flinched. The silver splashed into his mouth, searing his tongue and throat. White steam burst from his lips. His skin blistered and blackened as metal poured over him like molten rain. Some nobles turned away, weeping. Others stared, frozen in shock. The smell of burning flesh filled the courtyard. A young guard said later, "I still hear his screams when the forge fires roar." When it was over, the treasurer slumped forward. Molten silver cooled around his body, hardening into a gleaming shell. The metal clung to his hair, his mouth frozen mid-scream. Shapur gazed down at him, eyes empty of pity. Let this be the fate of any man who believes his wealth makes him king. The message was clear. No one in Persia would ever again mistake the treasurer's office for a throne. But the story doesn't end there, because Shapur II wasn't done shaping the fate of an empire. In the weeks that followed, Shapur's soldiers swept through the empire, uncovering hidden caches of silver. Nobles who had grown fat off corruption were stripped of their wealth or their lives. The royal treasury overflowed once more. The drachma, Persia's silver coin, became stronger than ever, a symbol of Shapur's restored power. With his house cleaned, Shapur turned his gaze outward. He launched new campaigns against Rome, determined to secure Persia's borders. His armies marched across deserts, capturing Roman forts and seizing cities. He built roads, rebuilt temples, and commissioned monumental rock reliefs showing himself triumphant over enemies. Shapur became known not just as a conqueror, but as Shapur the Great, the king who ruled longer than any other monarch in Persian history, and who drowned his own treasurer in silver to remind the world that the throne stood above all. But there's one question historians still debate. Was Shapur's punishment justice or tyranny? And if you think molten silver was cruel, wait until you hear about the Roman emperor who forced senators to swallow molten gold, or the Chinese emperor who buried 460 scholars alive to silence dissent. History is far darker and far more human than any fiction ever written. But first, let's answer the question. Was Shapur II a monster or a ruler who knew that fear was the price of order? After molten silver cooled around the treasurer's corpse, Shapur's empire entered a new era. The nobles whispered in darkened corridors. Merchants tread carefully, counting every coin. Because the message was unmistakable. No one's wealth could rival the king's. From the grandest satrap to the humblest tax collector, the fear of molten silver now hung over every transaction. While Shapur II tightened his grip at home, he looked westward to Rome. Emperors came and went, but Persia's neighbour remained both rival and prize. Shapur crossed the Euphrates again, laying siege to fortress cities. Roman governors fled before him. He demanded tribute, seized prisoners, and carried Roman banners back to Persia as trophies. Even Constantine, the great successors, learned to fear the Shahanshah, the King of Kings. But it wasn't just swords and spears that won Shapur his empire. It was his mastery of psychology and the calculated use of fear. Shapur II believed something simple but ruthless. An empire cannot be ruled by love alone. It must also be ruled by fear. The treasurer's death wasn't merely an execution. It was a symbol, a spectacle engineered to shatter the illusion that anyone could grow so powerful as to challenge the throne. And for the rest of his reign, no minister dared steal so much as a single silver drachm. By the time he died, in the year 379 CE, Shapur had ruled Persia for an astonishing 70 years. He had expanded Persia's borders, strengthened the empire's economy, preserved Persian culture against foreign threats, left behind some of the greatest rock reliefs in Iranian history. Carved into cliffs across Persia, his image still survives. A king towering above enemies, riding a powerful steed, crown, tall and fierce. It's the face of a ruler who combined vision with cruelty. A man who believed terror was sometimes the price of stability. But there's one question that echoes through history. Was Shapur a tyrant or a necessary ruler for a dangerous world? Historians remain divided over Shapur II's molten silver execution. Was it justified punishment for theft that endangered the empire's stability? Or was it a sign of a cruel despot who silenced rivals with fear? On one hand, Shapur protected Persia against Rome, restored the treasury, and left an empire stronger than he found it. On the other hand, he drowned a man in molten silver. Even today, Shapur's name surfaces when historians discuss the dark side of absolute power. Because Shapur's story leaves one burning question. How far should a ruler go to protect an empire, and at what cost? Even today, world leaders and CEOs fear the same thing Shapur did. That someone close to them might grow too rich, too powerful, too dangerous. Shapur's story may be ancient, but the lesson is timeless. But Shapur's story isn't unique. Because history is littered with kings and emperors who turned wealth into a weapon and drowned their enemies in molten metal. Think of Crassus, Rome's richest man, whose enemies poured molten gold down his throat. The Mongol warlords, who boiled rival chieftains alive in molten lead. The Chinese emperors, who executed corrupt officials in cauldrons of liquid bronze. Again and again, rulers used metal not just as treasure, but as punishment. To them, nothing was more poetic than killing a man with the very substance he coveted. So, was Shapur II a monster? Or simply a ruler forged by brutal times? One thing is certain. His reign left behind a warning as molten and deadly as silver itself. Ambition burns brightest just before it consumes you. Think Shapur's molten silver was savage? Wait until you hear how one Ottoman sultan ordered his baby brothers strangled before his coronation was even finished. Or the Roman emperor who turned dinner parties into death traps where guests never made it to dessert. So, was Shapur a monster, or a king who did what had to be done? Hit subscribe, because next time we'll reveal the Roman emperor who turned dinner parties into death traps. You won't believe how guests ended up as the main course.